It's a privilege to host you today at the Constitution Club of India for this timely and forward-looking panel discussion on bridging borders, exploring sovereign bond issuance in India and Sri Lanka infrastructure development.
It is my pleasure and my deep honor to welcome Her Excellency Mahishini Colonne. We are also very honored today to have amongst us Ambassador Sinha, who has been the Chief Information Commissioner of Government of India. This initiative brings together a very, shall I say, rich conglomeration of panelists who are experts on the subject.
Chairman of the India-Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Naresh Bana, Vice Chairman, Ambassador Yash Sinha, Session Chair, distinguished panelists, representatives of government, finance, and academia, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. I'm deeply honored to join you today at this important panel discussion on exploring the issuance of sovereign bonds in Indian rupees for Sri Lanka's infrastructure development. I'm particularly pleased that this discussion takes place at the Constitutional Club of India. Established soon after India's independence, the Constitution Club has served as a meeting ground for parliamentarians, thinkers, and policymakers. This is a space where democratic debate and exchange of ideas flourish beyond the walls of Parliament. Its very name reflects the values of dialogue, inclusiveness, and constitutional governance. For Sri Lanka, a fellow democracy in the region that shares much in common with India, historic bonds as well as contemporary aspirations, such as sustained economic development and growth, infrastructure development, better connectivity, energy security, green transition, stability and resilience, people-centered development, and a peaceful and stable Indian Ocean region. There is perhaps no better venue than this to explore a subject that is forward-looking, collaborative, and deeply connected with the future of our two nations. Sri Lanka and India share a civilizational partnership rooted in history, geography, and culture. In modern times, this partnership has been marked by firm solidarity in times of challenge. India has been the first responder whenever Sri Lanka has been in crisis. Most recently, during Sri Lanka's economic crisis, India came to Sri Lanka's assistance with critical support. Today, we look to the future. Infrastructure is the backbone of Sri Lanka's development agenda. Roads, airports, power plants, digital networks, seaports, and marine infrastructure, these are the arteries through which opportunities flow. The bridges connecting farmers to markets, children to schools and centers that prepare them for Industry 4.0, patients to critical care they need, and innovators to the global economy. Traditional financing mechanisms, such as budgetary allocations, domestic borrowing, and concessional loans, are insufficient to meet needs and demands. This is why innovative financing mechanisms, such as the issuance of sovereign bonds, becomes essential to unlock growth. Sovereign bonds are a well-established mechanism for governments to mobilize funds from domestic and international investors. I hope that this panel discussion, which is the first in a series of 3, the other 2 being planned in Colombo and Mumbai, will open minds, generate new ideas, address questions, and inspire confidence among stakeholders. Most importantly, I hope that it will reaffirm the message that India and Sri Lanka are not just neighbors, but partners in growth, stability, opportunity, and prosperity. I thank the India-Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce and Industry once again for organizing this event, and I look forward to the discussions and deliberations. Thank you.
And now we begin with our panel discussion, where our esteemed speakers will navigate the economic, regulatory, and diplomatic nuances of exploring INR-denominated sovereign bonds for Sri Lanka in Indian financial ecosystem.
We have experts with us who are going to elaborate on this very interesting modality of raising sovereign bonds to finance infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka. And I look forward to learning from them how that can be done. But before I sort of request them to share their expertise and knowledge on this subject, I'd just like to give a brief overview. The COVID-19, which struck the whole world, but this part of the world, in Sri Lanka being no exception, was badly affected. And then there were other policies of mismanagement which also led to this crisis, this perfect storm as I describe it. It was issues like low taxation, ban on import of fertilizers, etc., that precipitated the crisis. And if you recall those scenes on your television screen in March, it was in 2022, when the presidential palace was overrun by protesters, by the Araglia protests, which swept Sri Lanka and had a very deleterious impact on its economy. And since then, Sri Lanka has, and I've been back twice since then, once earlier this year, and I was pleasantly surprised to see the resilience of the Sri Lankan people, and of course the governments that followed stabilized the situation to a great extent. However, there is still a long way to go because the crisis, and I just give you an idea, if I recall correctly, it was 74% inflation when the crisis sort of broke in early 2022. Foreign exchange reserves were down, tourism had sort of been reduced to a trickle, and now all that has bounced back to a large degree, and the present government of President Dissanayake has succeeded in stabilizing, and of course his predecessor government, succeeded in stabilizing the situation. So I think India, which has stepped up as its closest, and I've always described not just the nearest, but also the dearest neighbor, came forward with a very healthy package of assistance, over $4 billion of grants and lines of credit, which helped stabilize Sri Lanka during dire times. And it's not just the amount of money, but it was also assistance in food aid, in medicines, in petroleum products, which turned things around during COVID, of course. COVID kits and vaccination kits, etc. So India and Sri Lanka share that symbiotic relationship. With these words, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Charan Singh.
So when you mentioned about Sri Lanka, while I totally agree with you, there's been a great turnaround and something to celebrate. It was right in our neighborhood. My overall hypothesis is that if we have to grow in the region, and we will grow in the region, that's obvious. The last 6 months of geopolitics makes it so apparent. India being the fastest growing economy in the world, large economy, 6.5%. China is a great example in front of us. How China gets its resources from the neighboring countries, strengthens the neighbors, and then the whole Chinese and neighboring bloc goes up. But when I look at Sri Lanka, there are certain worrisome points. The growth rate of the economy, as per the IMF, and I have great respect for data of IMF because I've worked at the IMF as a senior economist, the growth rate has lots of scope for improvement. And similarly, if I look at inflation, yes, it's within a good range, around 5%. But then the fiscal balance of the government is little on the higher side. I think that needs correction. The debt to GDP ratio is above 100%. I'm not a great fan of Maastricht Treaty recommendations, which said it should not be more than 60% of GDP. Here there are more than 100. And many Western countries in the world are recording more than 100. But when it is more than 100, obviously it has implications for the gross fiscal deficit, and it has implications for the expenditure pattern, and much of the budget is preempted in interest payments itself. And so if we are going to come out with INR denominated sovereign bonds dedicated for Sri Lanka, to me it looks to be a brilliant idea. I think it should be done. I'll tell you the reasons. We could do it, Sri Lankan government could do it, and our banks can easily subscribe to it. Our bank could take a lead and underwrite it. Firstly, our position on South-South. Secondly, that in our own region, we are coming out with bonds which are denominated in our currency. So to that extent, the exchange rate risk is minimal.
Thank you, Dr. Charan Singh. Just the other thing I just wanted to check, whether these bonds that are rupee denominated, would they be floated by the Sri Lankan government, a Sri Lankan financial institution, or do you think it would be better if an Indian financial institution floats these bonds?
So there are two ways of handling it. The government of Sri Lanka, under an MOU with India, can come out with a bond issuance which can be privately placed in our country by really rich institutions, which we have many. The alternate could be, again under an MOU arrangement with the government of India and Sri Lanka, the Indian financial institution can also float it, dedicated to Sri Lanka.
Final question. I know that I want to take advantage of experts being on this panel. How do you build investor trust? Because the macroeconomic and institutional safeguards have to be built in. Condition Sri Lanka finds itself in, how would they be able to attract stable, long-term investments?
I've been a banker all my life. I've always looked at commercial viability before I give a loan. And therefore, I'm obviously going to look at the country from the same angle and say, look, is it a commercially viable country? What's its demographics? What's its strength? What are the weaknesses? And strength and weaknesses are obviously measured from macro parameters: the growth rate in GDP, the non-performing assets of the financial institutions, number of projects, infrastructure that they have, scope of the projects, what is the legal system in case something goes wrong, what is the redressal mechanism I have. Last point I would like to make, sir, in this is political stability. That's the most important one. Rating agencies also are watching it, and their rating does make a difference. But these are the parameters that the rating agencies or investor would take into account while building trust. Thank you, sir.
The next speaker in the panel is from Sri Lanka, Mr. Dissanayake. He's the Minister, Councillor in Commercial Affairs in the Sri Lankan High Commission, and he will give us a Sri Lankan perspective, particularly in the context of what happened in 21-22, the economic crisis, and from where Sri Lanka has emerged now, and try and address some of the issues regarding confidence building and the investment environment that you have in Sri Lanka. Over to you.
As Dr. Sinha pointed out, the economic indicators, he pointed out the importance of import coverage and debt to the GDP ratio. Like in Sri Lanka, it's like Sri Lanka is twice the size of Kerala and half the size of population, like in the Indian context. And we had this, what you call the twin deficit for a long time, like the current account deficit and the capital account. So the revenue from taxes actually was not enough for the projects, funding, so we have to borrow. Like earlier it was not a case because we were like an LDC, so the loan rates were very like manageable. And how we manage was like export and when you look at the export and imports, always imports are like 4 billion, 3 billion more. So we have to bridge that gap. So what we did to bridge the gap was we got foreign remittance. Normally it was something like 7 to 8 billion, and also tourism, which earns like $4 to $5 billion annually. People who send remittance, so they did not send the remittance through the official channel. So that was also impacted, and the reserves actually fell something like $50 million. So we eventually had to kind of default. Need of the hour is to diversify exports and to increase outputs. So we, in order for us to do that, we have to like get more investment. So we are kind of now trying to do that through now because of this problem. We had to undergo this IMF extended fund facility arrangement, which gives us like $3.8 billion. And so in that, of course, there are conditions like there are limits for borrowings and expenditure. Like the targets are like in 2025, the budget deficit has to be between 10 to 5%. So there are some strict controls. Now, according to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, 2024, the growth rate was 5%. And now they are predicting something over 4% for this year. And for the first time in 20 years, the current account was in surplus. So that is the situation right now.
Thank you, Mr. Dissanayake. I recall when with your crisis, you had a debt of over $100 billion, which was really huge, and an external debt was about 50% almost of that, and more than 50%. And the problem was these white elephants, if I could call it, the debt that you got into your previous governments on, for instance, the Hambantota port, the Matala stadium, the convention center, and and most recently the port city. And ironically, the investment that you're expecting in the port city, which of course we were not very happy with, you expect from Indian investors. So that is going to be a very it's not going to be an easy sell. So I think performance is, your economic performance is going to be of prime importance. May I go to my next speaker for this afternoon, Ms. Vidisha Krishan. She's an expert on investment and capital markets. Can we start with the financial market perspective? In your view, which categories of bonds stand to gain most from a secondary listing in India's emerging hub, the GIFT City in Gandhinagar, and what broader advantages do you see in international bonds being listed in India, both for issuers like Sri Lanka and for investors?
So that's a little technical question. I'll give you all a brief background of the current scenario and what's desirable. Sovereign bond means sovereign debt. That's the last thing you need. What is it that is currently working across border for you? Everybody here has talked about establishing the Indian rupee geopolitically. I agree with that. That's a fantastic concept. And for us as Indians, to internationalize our currency, I think it's fantastic if our neighbors get over the territorial conflicts and can come and trade in our currency. So we could be like the next euro. I agree with the panelists on that. But today, I speak as a lawyer who is doing a lot of issuances across India, cross-border into India, and vice versa. What is it that is working? It is not issuer-based. It is project-based. Today, I can highlight a bond of Sri Lanka trading in the GIFT City and doing very well. It is DFCC's green bond. It is based on renewable energy projects in Sri Lanka. It is an LKR denominated $2.5 billion bond trading on CSE, the Colombo Stock Exchange. It has a secondary listing in Luxembourg as well as INX in GIFT City. Now, what does a secondary listing do for you, and what technically are these bonds when I talk about cross-border listing? I have a very good Sri Lankan bond, which has an ICMA registration with regard to its ESG compliances, climate sensitivity, everything. It has great projects. It is trading in Sri Lanka in LKR. That does away with your USD linked, your currency issues. And it is mirrored in Gift City. It is also mirrored in Luxembourg. What does this mirroring get you? It gets you international investors' visibility. The moment an international investor in Gift City and Luxembourg sees an LKR bond being traded, it comes immediately to CSE and buys it. This international investment into Sri Lanka insulates Sri Lankan bond markets from domestic shocks, which is the first thing you need. Your biggest problem is that currently with a lot of debt, you are exposed to domestic shocks and then very big USD linked shocks. It's happened from our end, from the banking side. There are lots of RBI enabled wash-through accounts which do away with your banking risk of paying back debt in USD. But with regard to capital markets, let's say you have a Sri Lankan sovereign bond, again which is making debt very heavy on your issuers' books, your government. If you have a sovereign linked bond being traded or denominated in Indian rupee, the first challenge you face is institutional investor confusion. This has happened in the past. There was a central bank fiasco. After that, there was some confusion with ADB linked bonds also. So, to me, if you really want to explore a Sri Lankan sovereign bond denominated in Indian currency, you start at the regulatory level of both the government signing an MOU, it coming down to your financial institutions, cross-border investment, but prior to listing and trading, you need a lot of international institutional investor sensitization as to yes, this is a country's bond, but denominated in Indian currency. It's been 10 years since. Today, what are the bonds I'm issuing? I'm issuing green bonds, blue bonds, social bonds issued by every small municipality across India. So the waterfall mechanism and the policy of the Indian government is let the project and municipalities speak for themselves. So not just for India, even for Sri Lanka, in the next 3 to 5 years, if you have a viable project, you will get funding. I think that ties up with the port city you were talking about, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Krishan. Our next speaker is Dr. Naresh Bana, who is an expert on PPP. You've advocated PPP as a bridge between public needs and private capital. How do you see India's financial markets and particularly rupee-denominated instruments supporting Sri Lanka's infrastructure revival?
Thank you, sir. And thank you, everyone, Her Excellency, for gracing this. And all of us may also would like to acknowledge that we have a representative from the BIMSTEC. We had invited the BIMSTEC diplomatic missions also, and we have Mr. Pandey Dorji from Bhutan, Royal Bhutan Embassy, Economic Counselor. And coming back to the question, this issue, because I am a project person, and having been interacting with Sri Lanka for quite some time now, one of the shortfall was always funding of the project. So we have been discussing it in various fora, in especially in 2023 when I was part of a event in Abu Dhabi, which was organized by UNCTAD, and I was speaking under the aegis of World Association, where I'm one of the co-founder. So we discussed this issue, and the World Bank and other experts were also of the view what the experts here have just reconfirmed, that yes, it's a very good idea. So when I sounded this idea with Dr. Charan Singh, he was also very keen to take it on, and we discussed it. The session chair also liked it, and finally the Madam Her Excellency. I'm of the firm opinion that Sri Lanka can utilize the sovereign bonds as a strategic tool. I feel that the sovereign bonds, in my view, have three major advantages if they are issued by Sri Lanka in Indian denominated Indian currency. Firstly, they can tap into our Indian large and liquid capital markets, which are not only doing very well, but their structure is one of the best in the world. And secondly, not only it will give them the funds at comparatively lesser borrowing cost, but also it's diversifying their sources of funds, because ADB only given them about $900 million in recent past, which is being utilized on transmission lines and many other critical projects. Now, then the third thing is the bilateral relations, which will enhance, it will strengthen. But all this, to sustain this, we have to have that the projects are planned very carefully. One of the blended finance finest example is in Bhutan, the Dhagachu hydropower project, where ADB funds along with the local funds, the government funds, have been wonderfully utilized, and it has set an example for the world, the Dhagachu hydropower project. Similarly, for other projects, because one is the money which has come from funds, which I will talk about how that can be best utilized for developing the project, and subsequently for making it viable. So in addition to blending it with the multilateral discounted concessional finance, you can have public-private partnerships where the investors can be encouraged, because part of this fund can be utilized as viability gap funding to make the project bankable. Rest of the money comes through the investor, and the project becomes workable, constructible, and start generating revenue. The prudence has to be always exercised in making the projects or selecting the projects. Like the panelists have mentioned, they should not appear and become non-performing assets, like some of them have been mentioned, like Hambantota Port and things like that. So the PPP projects are best taken up with such kind of funds. I am sure if these sovereign bonds are issued and subscribed and funds are generated, it can unlock potential for investment and also accelerate the construction of the projects and develop a lot of confidence in the economy of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Colonel Bana. Just one the final question is, in your capacity as Vice Chairman of the Indian Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I recall when you started this, and General Lumba mentioned it, it was 2016 or 17, sorry, 16 I think. General V.K. Singh was the Minister of State for External Affairs, and we did it in the Constitution Club, the inauguration. So that was a very good, and I was in Colombo those days, and I had come at that time. From then till now, you have played a very important role in promoting relations. Of course, you've had the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, but now how do you see the Chamber playing a role in promoting an investor conducive climate and encouraging Indian investors in going to Sri Lanka, because that's important. So how do you think the Chamber can play an important role here?
That's very pertinent. Thank you, sir. And thank you for recollecting how our journey, which began in 2016, and we are sitting here now again. So Chamber is playing a stellar role, and our chairman is here. So what we are primarily is we are interacting with the investors, and this particular forum has, and the series has been planned towards that only, because the inputs which we have got from the environment in Sri Lanka as well as here, our advisors in Sri Lanka are very senior people, Dr. Sarath Obesekara and Dr. Uday Senaviratne, without whom I would say our effort would not be total, because a whole lot of inputs which we get and advocacy we do is with their help. And this advocacy and this industry leadership role is that we have planned it out, and we have been constantly and regularly interacting with the investors, identifying the gaps, like the funding gap, like the matchmaking issues, like the cultural sensitivities, like many other land issues, the legal issues, the risks. So these are the things among many where we had also been advocating the digital infrastructure integration and digital infrastructure promotion. In fact, this session is also being sponsored by Telecommunication Consultants of India. So to that extent, we have been trying to take it forward. And I would recollect that in March this year, when we hosted our first edition of Matrishi Awards, and we were supported by Kribco, and I think the director Kribco is here, and they are doing a lot of things in Sri Lanka. And overall, we are, despite the initial, because Chamber is just into its 10th year, so we are trying to build our what should I say, personality as an institution, and trying to do our bit. Thank you, sir.
So in the context of your experience, can you throw some light on what is the potential of such cross-border investments or instruments, and how Sri Lanka may benefit specifically from these instruments?
When we are talking of bonds, when we are talking of currency issues, when we are talking of getting bilateral trade done, it's very important to understand the local environments of the other countries which are issuing the bonds. And it's very important to have institutions playing a very, very active role in this matter. Because it's not just about the government, and government has to designate institutions. For example, Bangladesh. Bangladesh wanted to have a good infrastructure system. We helped them to have another IIFCL of Bangladesh. We instituted a mechanism so that they have a primary premier financial institution which can look at all the facets of financing as well as development. We were talking about environment and social safeguard systems, sustainable systems. So how the resilience can be built up within the entire framework, and how this can prove to be a very robust and long-term serving institutional framework forward. I think that is very, very important. If we have these reforms, and if we have these state level, ground level work done very well, you have a very sound and robust platform for issuing any papers that you need.
My next question flows from what you just said. The regulatory mechanism required for Sri Lankan authorities, the regulations needed for Sri Lankan authorities to float Indian rupee denominated bonds in sovereign bonds in Indian stock exchanges, on Indian stock exchanges. Authorities like SEBI and RBI, what sort of approvals would be required?
Actually, when we look at floating instruments by institutions, I don't think any extra approval is required, because SEBI has a framework, RBI has its own framework. So unless the government is going to directly float instrument where there is a government-to-government memorandum of understanding, the normal instruments can be, in the regular SEBI framework. So I don't think any extra approvals will be necessary for that.
Thank you, Dr. Jaishankar.
Once again, Excellency, distinguished guests, and everybody who is present here, thank you very much for sparing your valuable time. We have all discussed a very important and relevant issue today, which will not only strengthen the bilateral relationship, but will also set an example in this, not only in this region, but also in the world, that yes, when neighbors decide, they can do it, and they can do it without much hassles. So towards that, I am sure that this episode, which is first in the series of 3, will set the pace, and now when we meet in Colombo, we would be more strengthened and more aware, and possibly we will be able to have an even more engaging discourse. And with that, we close this event. That's all. Thank you very much. Jai Hind. Ayubhavan.